Today we are going to look at the first short story we will read this year, which is The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell. Here's some information about the author. Richard Connell started writing from an early age, reporting local baseball games for his father's newspaper in Poughkeepsie, New York. He went on to Harvard, where he wrote for the Harvard Lampoon. He wrote many short stories, but his most famous is The Most Dangerous Game. Connell fought in World War I, and even though his personal experiences do not relate to the plot of his story, this time in the war does draw some influence. The main point of this presentation is to review literary elements that you need to observe in the story. Our first element is conflict, which is a struggle between two opposing forces. There are two types of conflict, internal and external conflict. Internal conflict is a struggle that takes place in a character's mind. So an example of internal conflict is a character may have to decide between right or wrong or between two solutions to a problem. So internal conflict is something that is internal. It takes place within the character. External conflict is a struggle between a character and an outside force. There are several types of conflict that's external. You could have conflict with another character, a community, or a force of nature. An example of this is the character may struggle against the Arctic cold, which would be an outside force. Here are the specific types of internal and external conflict. For internal, you would have the character versus the self. So a good example of this is the Grinch whenever he's trying to decide if he's going to go to the holiday party in Whoville. He's battling with himself whether or not he's going to do it. External conflict. You have character versus character, so Harry Potter versus Lord Voldemort. You could have character versus nature, so Dorothy versus the Twister, or character versus society, which is community. So an example of that is Katniss versus the Capitol. Now we're going to look at the time and sequence of plot. So to begin, you have the exposition. During the exposition, we learn important background information about the protagonist. We learn about the setting, the main character, and their background. Then we are introduced to the conflict. After the exposition, the audience is introduced to the conflict in the story, where something happens that creates a problem for the protagonist. Every story has a conflict. Then you are introduced to the rising action. After we learn of the conflict, the rising action occurs where the audience is introduced to a sequence of events that happen as a result of the conflict. These events typically get more intense over time. Then we have the climax. This is the most exciting part of the story and the turning point. This seems to be the most intense moment of the story. Then we have the falling action. The falling action includes the events that take place after the climax. The falling action can happen fairly quickly. And lastly, we have the resolution. This is where the conflict has been solved. All the loose ends are tied up, and we see how things have changed as a result of the events that took place in the story. And remember, the time and sequence of a plot can be mapped on a story arc. So that is the triangle that you see that diagrams the plot. And then lastly, we're going to look at foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is a literary device in which an author gives the reader a hint as to what will come later on in the story. As you read the story, look for hints that may point you towards what will happen in the story, specifically when we are reading The Most Dangerous Game.